welcome to Sophie & Co. Me, Sophie Shevardnadze. The 2008 economic meltdown was the biggest shock to the world since the Great Depression, but some analysts are warning that the worst is yet to come. What's behind this dreary outlook? What's impacting global economic growth and decline? Investor publisher of the Gloom, Boom and Doom report, Marc Faber, is with me today to share his predictions for the world economy.
Still struggling to fully heal the wounds of the 2008 financial crisis, the global economy may be heading straight into another one, even more disastrous than the last. Will politicians be able to let the free market run its course, or will the state have to take the reins? And with the central banks tightening their grip on the world market, will their efforts tame the coming storm or make a catastrophe inevitable?
World-famous investor, publisher of the Gloom, Boom, Doom report, Dr. Doom, Marc Faber. Welcome to the show. It's really great to have you with us. Now, sir, the outcome of the U.S. vote in November won't just impact the American economy. The whole world will feel it. You're saying that your worst fear is Hillary Clinton will become president of the United States. You said she's a questionable character. I mean, you might not like her personally, but why do you say that she'll destroy the whole world? Do you mean to say that her actions will be harmful to the global economy? And if yes, then how?
Well, if you look at her period during which she was Secretary of State, the U.S. committed several aggressions in the Middle East, including also the invasion of Libya. Libya, which was probably the only properly functioning African economy. So I would say that her achievements with nation building has been a catastrophe. And then, if you put yourself into the shoes of, say, Mr. Putin or of the Chinese, she declared, while she was Secretary of State, America's pivot to Asia. Wouldn't you consider that to be an aggression? China has never begun a war. They were always drawn into wars by foreign powers, and now the U.S. acts in provocation of China.
Well, you know what Ms. Clinton is saying? She said that if she's elected, she will put her husband, former President Bill Clinton, in charge of the U.S. economy to revitalize the U.S. economy. Now, he oversaw a period of economic growth in the U.S. in the 90s.
Yes.
Can he be entrusted with the American economy once again?
Yes. He will revitalize corruption in America. The Clinton family is involved in so many scandals. That is what is going to happen. There will be massive and increased crony capitalism. The US always accuses other countries of corruption, of crony capitalism. But in America, it's even more extreme.
Okay, now let's talk about your other favorite candidate, the famous Donald Trump. Now, you believe that he won't destroy the world, but he will destroy the U.S. economy. He's a businessman. He's a deal maker. Why don't you think he can steer the might of the American economy in the right direction?
Well, look, to be frank with you, I don't support any of the available candidates. But if I had to make a choice, in other words, you put the gun on my head and say, Mark, you must choose someone, either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, for sure I would choose Donald Trump because he's a businessman and he has some common sense and he is an outsider and not necessarily supported by the Republican Party. My favorite candidate in terms of intellect, unfortunately misguided views about the economy, but in terms of intellect, is actually Bernie Sanders. He's quite an intelligent man who already in 2003 attacked the US Federal Reserve, at that time Mr. Greenspan, that his monetary policies had created wealth for Wall Street and for people that owned assets, but had done very little for ordinary people in the United States. And this has been now proven to be correct. And even Mr. Greenspan, later in 2008, in a congressional inquiry, accepted the fact that his models had been flawed.
Now, Trump and Bernie Sanders, they're not like your traditional presidential candidates, so to say, right? And the reason these two have such appeal with people, you've said it, is because of the problems in the American economy. A lack of growth, unemployment. Is the economy heading into serious trouble?
Yes, the economy in America is like Botox operation. In other words, you create on the surface something that looks quite okay, but behind the scene, it's not so okay. If we look precisely at, say, labor statistics, so jobs in the manufacturing sector are being cut. The manufacturing sector is no longer very important in the US, but jobs in leisure and hospitality and barmen and waiters are going up strongly. Full-time jobs are being reduced and part-time jobs are being created. So if you really analyze the figures, and including also the figures that come out about the budget deficit, in other words, the fiscal stimulus and so forth, they all look horrible. Superficially, the US will tell you, well, our deficit has shrunk from over $1 trillion to, say, $450 billion. But I'm adding the government debt every year. And by that measure, last year, the deficit was close to $1 trillion. And the government debt in the US since Ms. Obama became president 8 years ago has gone from 8 trillion to now over $19 trillion. These are the facts.
Now, you mentioned Fed Reserve. Fed raised interest rates for the first time in almost a decade in December, and it plans to keep on doing that in 2016, being optimistic about the American economy. But after a bleak job report, it's backtracking on its plans for the moment. With its reputation at stake, will it proceed with the plans later this year? What do you think?
Well, what I think is there will be a museum in future of great central banking errors. One of them will be to have introduced negative interest rates in Europe and also in other parts of the world, notably in Japan. And the other one, prominently displayed at the entrance of the Museum of Central Banking Policy Mistakes, will be a bust of Miss Yellen, a huge bust, because they slashed the Fed fund rate to next to zero in December 2008. By 2010, 2011, the economy was actually recovering quite well. That is when they should have increased rates somewhat. But they waited, Ms. Yellen, she waited precisely until December 2015, when it was obvious that the economy and the global economy was decelerating very badly and most likely entering a recession. So in other words, she's increasing rates exactly at the time when you shouldn't be increasing rates.
Should investors expect interest rates to remain low in the United States forever?
My sense is that they're not going to move the Fed fund rate higher. But if they move the Fed fund a bit higher, say by 0.25%, they're not going to move again anytime soon. In other words, if you expect the Fed fund rate to go up substantially, you'll likely be wrong.
So, sir, will the next economic crisis be worse than the one in 2008? And when should we expect this crisis to hit? Can you give us a deadline?
Well, we never really came out of the 2007-2008 recession. We had massive fiscal stimulus. We had massive monetary stimulus. In other words, if you just throw money at the system, then spending goes up, but there are still huge imbalances. And in my view, the world is facing very, very low growth going forward, very low growth. And that there are structural reasons for that. We have a horrible, and I repeat, horrible bureaucracy in Brussels, the EU, that basically is a slave of the US. The US dictates a lot of policies in Europe, including they bought or blackmailed Mrs. Merkel to be hostile against Russia. Russia and Germany and Russia and Europe were historically very close to each other. But this has now changed. And actually, one reason I'm quite optimistic about Russia, I believe the people of Europe, they don't want to have an embargo against Russia. It's just the governments that do that. The ordinary people, they have actually a lot of sympathy for Russia and for Mr. Putin.
All right, Mr. Faber, we're going to take a short break right now. On that note, when we're back, we'll continue talking to Marc Faber, renowned investor, publisher of the Gloom, Boom, Doom report, to talk about the best choice of currency for today's investors and more. Stay with us.
Do we speak your language? Want news, programs and documentaries in Spanish? What matters to you? Breaking news, alternative angles, hidden stories. Are you here? Then try RT Spanish. To find out more, visit actualidad.rt.com.
Today I'm directing my administration to cut through the red tape, break through the bureaucratic hurdles, and make this project a priority.
Keystone XL pipeline.
The Keystone XL has become a household name, but what do we know about the communities living along the proposed route?
When you look at the percentage of refineries in our area compared to the amount of people with cancer, it's got to be a link.
We're being disproportionately bombarded with the toxic waste from these facilities because we don't have a voice.
Building alliances with different organizations and communities is very important because we're spread thin throughout the area.
We went on a road trip to meet some of these communities on the front lines of resistance.
This is Boom Bust, and these are the stories we are tracking for you today.
I think that the euro is severely undervalued.
That's the highest output in over 3 years.
What the Fed really wants is inflation.
The U.S. has more than doubled imports from Iraq.
All that debt that was accumulated, they have to pay it off.
And when you see oil go down, our economy goes down.
What do you make of that data, and what does it really mean for the average worker?
And we're back with Marc, Dr. Doom Faber. investment advisor and fund manager, publisher of the Gloom, Boom and Doom report, talking about the prospects of the world markets in the times of turbulence. Welcome back. So you say the dollar is not a desirable currency. Why don't you trust the dollar?
Well, in my view, the US have never pursued policies that are designed to strengthen the US dollar. Whenever there was an economic problem in the US, the view was let the dollar float down and make America again competitive. And I have to say this about the subject. If I look around the world, and this is my personal experience, but also the experience historically seen through literature, then countries with a weak currency always had weak exports. And countries that had a strong currency always had strong exports and were competitive. Why? The reason is that if your currency appreciates, the entrepreneurs have to remain very competitive by productivity improvements. In other words, they have to acquire new machines that can produce the same or more quantity with less energy, with less input. And so in general, you have to see that the weak currency economies like Zimbabwe, as an example, an extreme example, or Argentina or Brazil, that these countries have poor export performance relative to the rest of the world. You also look at Switzerland, you look at Japan, they have very strong export economies.
But what is a desirable currency? The Chinese yuan, perhaps? Can anything compete with US dollar at this point?
Well, my sense is that there is only one currency in the world that will appreciate, and these are precious metals: gold, silver, platinum.
Really? Do you keep your savings in precious metals?
I do not keep all my savings in precious metals, but historically seen, cash has been a bad investment, and over time, all paper monies have lost their purchasing power. So I hold some gold and silver. I'm also on the board of directors of mining companies. I hold real estate, mostly here in Asia, specifically in Vietnam. I hold some stocks, maybe 25% of total assets, and I hold some bonds and cash. So I'm diversified. But basically, an investor should realize that paper money will lose its purchasing power.
But the little cash that you do have stored aside, what currency do you keep it in?
Well, unfortunately, in absence of anything better, I have quite a lot of exposure to US dollars, but I also have exposure, maybe 30% of the cash in euros and in euro bonds denominated in euros. I also own Russian assets, and I have Singapore dollars, and I have some Hong Kong dollars. But in general, I don't think that cash will be a very good investment, in the sense that, A, you have no interest at the present time. You have risks with the banks because the bank can fail. And you have also a higher risk of expropriation, wealth taxes, in other words, in Europe. So cash is not the most desirable. But equally, if you buy shares, okay, in Russia, shares are inexpensive. And in many other emerging economies, they're also relatively inexpensive. But in the US, the stock market is at the very high valuation, price to earnings, price to sales, and so forth. So I don't think that stocks will perform well.
Why do countries choose to hold savings in American treasuries? Japan, China, Russia. What's up with that?
Well, first of all, so much money was printed and is floating around the world. I mean, foreign exchange reserves are huge and they've been going up. Recently, they've been contracting, but nevertheless, they've been going up, and you have all the sovereign funds. So if you're running a sovereign funds and you have $1 trillion in assets to invest, are you going to buy the Thai baht or the Philippine peso and so forth? You understand? You have an asset allocation, and the bulk will obviously be a basket of currencies, so the majority will be in US dollars, and then you will hold some euros and yen and British pounds. But that's the way it is. But it may not stay that way. If you go back to, say, 1900, the major foreign exchange reserve currency was the British pound, and today it's a sideshow. So I think over time, the US dollar will lose its importance.
You know, I want to talk about a recent scandal. One of the biggest leaks in financial history, the Panama Papers that were exposed. They exposed shady dealings of a number of world leaders, President of Argentina, now a former Prime Minister of Iceland, the Saudi king, a lot of celebrities were implicated. Will the uproar bring about enhanced control over tax evasion and avoidance?
Well, I have to laugh about these Panama Papers because it's obvious. It's another hidden attack against Russia, the Russian government, and other wealthy people around the world. But of course, no American would even think of evading taxes. That would never occur to an American mind. But the fact is simply, if I open a company in the British Virgin Islands, in Panama, anywhere in the world, I have to declare the beneficial ownership. But you don't have to declare the beneficial ownership in a Delaware company in the US. So it's a hypocritical act, once again, initiated by people in the US who want basically to put down foreign regimes. It's like if FIFA was an American organization, nothing would happen. But it happens that FIFA built up the biggest business in the world, which is soccer. And it happens that the World Cup will be played in Russia and not in the US. So obviously they target FIFA.
Now in Europe, the Eurozone troubles were the center of attention just a little while ago, and they've been eclipsed by other issues like the refugee crisis, the terrorist threat. It's widely recognized that without considerable reforms, the euro and the Eurozone will be difficult to sustain. Nobel economist Chris Pissarides told me that there should be two kinds of euros for the differing economies of Europe, a euro south and a euro north. Could this work in practice? Would you support a solution like that?
I'm a supporter of dismantling the whole EU and have individual countries, but I'd like to add to the problem of the currency the following. The Europeans and the Japanese and also the US, they always talk about reforms and so forth and so on. So how do you go about a market-based reform if the market was reforming countries? The worst policy is essentially zero interest rates, because at zero interest rates, governments can borrow money without any cost for a while. In other words, the US government debt has grown from $4 trillion in 1994 to now over $19 trillion, but the interest expense is down because the level of interest rates has collapsed. The same in Europe. If you look at the debt profile of Europe, we economists, we distinguish, I mean, at least I do, between productive debt and unproductive debt. The productive debt is you and I borrow money and we build a factory, we buy the machinery and we produce something. And then the cash flow from this business will sustain the interest payments and the repayment of the debt. Unproductive credit is basically government credit. You lend money to the government, and the government will then give it away to people. You know, there's a redistribution of wealth. That is very unproductive credit. And in Europe and in the US, government credit as a percent of the economy has grown enormously over the last 10, 20 years, enormously.
I want to talk a bit about the deal that US and Europe are negotiating, the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. That's being done in secret, and it's supposed to be extremely beneficial to remove trade barriers and open up markets. So why keep it a secret?
Well, I don't know about, trade restrictions and so forth. All I can say is that we had already free trade for hundreds of years between different countries. And we had merchant families in the world that traded goods and so forth. I don't think that for free trade, you need an EU or you need a Trans-Pacific Partnership and so forth. You can have bilateral agreements for free trade. What you certainly do not need for free trade is a country like the US that declares an embargo. They had an embargo against Myanmar. They had an embargo against Cuba. For what? They have an embargo against Russia. You think Russia cannot buy a Mercedes car? They can import everything through China. Russia has been surrounded by countries, Baltic countries and also Balkan countries in the south, and Central Asia, countries that have specialized in smuggling for thousands of years. And the Americans, they think the embargo will hurt Russia. They're ridiculous.
Mr. Faber, thank you so much for this wonderful interview. We were talking to Marc Faber, world-famous investor, financial advisor known as Dr. Doom, publisher of Gloom, Boom, and Doom Report, discussing the impending global economic crisis and all the smart ways to survive it. That's it for this edition of Sophie & Co. I'll see you next time.
Thank you.